Hello and welcome to Social Science Weekly, where we take the most important social science papers, giving you just the facts and none of the spin. The paper we're looking at today is called Slavery and the British Industrial Revolution. It's a working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, initially published in September 2022. So a working paper is something that economists tend to do. Essentially, it's a paper that is still being developed and is not yet peer-reviewed by a journal. So bear in mind that the version we are presenting to you today may not be the version that ends up in a peer-reviewed journal. The three authors on this paper are Stefan Heiblick from the University of Toronto, Stephen Redding from Princeton University, and Hans Joachim Voth from the University of Zurich. Okay, let's get started. The Industrial Revolution, which began around 1800, was primarily initiated in Britain, which led to 2 centuries of unprecedented economic growth. However, it's essential to remember that during this time, Britain was also grappling with the issue of slavery, first abolishing the slave trade in 1807, and then subsequently outlawing slavery altogether in 1833. Before 1807, in fact, Britain was a major player in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, this raises critical questions about the extent to which slavery in Britain's colonies contributed to the Industrial Revolution and the rapid economic growth that followed. Would the gains have been faster or slower, more or less, without the practice of slavery in the early years of the Industrial Revolution? The era depended heavily on the investment of capital in machines, in cotton mills and steam engines and things like that. And to what extent was the capital derived from slave ownership used to invest in these industrial practices? The paper we're discussing today seeks to answer these questions. In this study, the authors focus on the different regions of England and Wales, roughly between the years 1750 and 1850, to examine if the same regions that had significant wealth from slave ownership also saw early indicators of the Industrial Revolution. The authors utilised fine-grained geographic data, splitting England and Wales into 849 equal chunks, each representing approximately 9 kilometres by 9 kilometres. They then mapped various data sets onto these different regions for the analysis. They used 7 types of data in the study, and we'll cover the most relevant ones for our purposes now. First, they measured the prevalence of slave ownership in all of these different regions. To do this, they looked at the compensation claims made by slave owners when slavery was abolished in 1833. The former slave owners had to register their addresses and other information when they claimed compensation from the government for their lost slaves. The slavery compensation data is collated by the Centre for the Study of Legacies of British Slavery at the University College London. Next, the authors mapped indicators that the Industrial Revolution was happening onto these regions. And the 4 main indicators they used are, number 1, employment structure. So they examined the types of jobs that people had, whether they worked in manufacturing or agriculture. This is because a higher number of people employed in factories, rather than on farms, indicated that the Industrial Revolution had taken a hold. The second data source was cotton mills. So the authors looked at the number of cotton mills in each region. Cotton mills were mechanized quite early on in the Industrial Revolution, and they produced cotton, which is an essential material used during the Industrial Revolution. The next indicator was steam engines. So the study looked at the use of steam engines, which was a critical technology that powered the Industrial Revolution. The authors examined 520 British newspapers that advertised steam engines for sale, finding 20,000 references to steam engines between 1755 and 1850. These references were then mapped onto the different regions in England and Wales. And the final indicator was property valuation. So they looked at the value of properties in these regions, dating all the way back to the Domesday Book in 1086. Now, although property value is actually not a direct indicator of industrialization, it did allow the authors to extend their time horizons all the way back before the Industrial Revolution to the Middle Ages. And this meant that they could check, using that data, whether the wealthy slave-owning regions of England and Wales were already wealthy prior to the slave trade taking off, or whether they got more wealthy later on. Now, on to the findings. Regions with prevalent slaveholding in the early 1800s also saw indications of the Industrial Revolution. And these areas included urban areas like Liverpool, London, and Bristol. These regions had more people working in manufacturing, more cotton mills, and more steam engines. Also, the relationship between slaveholding and steam engine use grew stronger over time. On top of this, the property data shows that regions with many slave owners were not significantly wealthier prior to the abolition of slavery and the Industrial Revolution. Other factors, though, also predicted the emergence of industry, such as the presence of an existing cotton mill, possibly offering a first mover advantage to those regions, and also access to the postal service. Geography may have also played a role, with specific regions like Liverpool, Bristol, and London experiencing more industrialization and more slave ownership. However, one consistent alternative factor influencing industrialization was the presence of a nearby bank, which, like slave ownership, would have served as a source of capital for investment in industrialization. So, wrapping up, this study demonstrates a link between the investment of wealth from the slave trade and economic development, including the adoption of new industrial practices such as steam engines and a shift from agriculture to manufacturing employment. In regions with significant slave ownership prior to abolition in 1833, there was substantial economic development. These regions include London, Bristol, and Liverpool. This suggests that capital gained from slave ownership, including the compensation paid after the abolition of slavery, played a role in Britain's adoption of new industrial practices that kick-started economic development in the 19th century. In addition, various other factors likely played a role, notably proximity to a bank, because banks provided another source of capital for investment in industrialization. Okay, we will provide a link to this paper and other interesting resources in the description below. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe. It really helps us out and it means we can make more of this content. To keep up to date with Social Science Weekly, you can get us on all of the different social medias. And that's it for Social Science Weekly, bringing you just the facts, none of the spin, from the best and most important social science.